Hello and welcome to Gastrowave. I'm your host, Caoimhe.
And I'm Robin. Now, today we're going to be talking about the recent trend that is sourdough. We're going to try to unpick it.
Hopefully by the end of this podcast, you'll have a little bit more understanding of the history of bread, a little bit of class struggle, and just a little bit of fun. So the topic of the week that we've chosen is bread, and I think it was kind of like a natural choice because in obviously this current climate that we're facing with the pandemic and the kind of change in attitudes towards eating and shopping and etc., we've seen this like massive increase in the demand for bread products like flour and yeast. So kind of made the most sense to take a deep dive into why is this happening. And I think there's no better place to start than, well, what is bread and how did it come about and why is it now become the symbol of this global pandemic, but also the symbol of our modern culture. So take it away, Robin.
Well, thank you, Caoimhe. I'm glad you asked, and obviously I'm an authority on the topic as a professor in bread science.
Just want to preempt this and say that neither of us are professionals of bread or of the human existence. We just like to shoot the shit and flagellate and talk a lot about it. And also, we're not going to share recipes. We're not, this isn't a podcast where you're going to learn how to bake bread. You might pick up a couple of things or two. Mostly you're going to come away with some really weird facts. And
a lot of trivia.
A lot of trivia.
I'm glad you asked me about the history of bread because I did kind of dig into the research a little bit here. So bread does have a very long history with humans, but it didn't always start as bread. We didn't go from zero bang hunter-gatherer straight into the full sourdough loaf. There was a process. And when I read through A History of Food by Toussaint Samat, excuse me if I'm butchering that name, but my French is probably worse than my baking. He describes a number of stages, and I think this is a very good way to understand it, and it's a very good way to unpick it. So in early hunter-gatherer societies, it became apparent that grains were a good source of calories, a good, easy source of calorie. So proto-wheats and proto-barleys, grains of that kind, were gathered and pounded into powders and then consumed like that because it's easier to digest. And the natural progression from that is to mix these grains into a paste, into a gruel or a porridge. So that was the next progression from grain to pounded grain to porridge. And then at some point, that porridge was cooked on a hot stone or put into a fire into, again, a sort of proto-flatbread. The author, Toussaint Samat, he describes this as a maza, so similar to the flatbreads we see in Jewish tradition. And then at some point, someone left this porridge mix on the side, perhaps in early Egyptian time. No one really has a solid date on when leavened bread began. But this was left on the side and became inoculated with wild yeast, wild bacteria, and started to ferment. Mm-hmm. And that began the leavening process. Now, this will have been baked, and then it will have risen and formed an early bread. Now, from this point, bread really started to develop, and then methods and rituals surrounding the leavening of bread started to arise. To the point that there's an insane plethora of breads available now and in antiquity. I looked up a type of inverted pyramid Egyptian oven that creates these weird twin truncated cone breads. There are flatbreads topped with pickled fish that then went on to become pizzas. There are frescas, wall paintings of mushroom-shaped. Thanks. I'm really showing my.
I thought you were going to say bread. I was like, wait.
Painting on bread. No, mushroom-shaped loaves covered in poppy seeds, square loaves, pleated loaves, all kinds of loaves. There was an ancient Greek writer called Athenaeus that describes 72 different styles of bread, each with established traditions, already in early Greece, just describing that area. So it has as soon as that leavening process was developed, the methodology of bread exploded.
And somewhere along the way, we figured out too that if we saved a little bit of each of the batches of this dough, we could use it to make the next one.
Yeah.
So, the progeny, it was already, we evolved the way that bread evolved too. And it's fascinating that you've mentioned that, because the story of bread and the story of us, human race, they are inextricably linked. And, the cultivation and civilization are also linked. The Greek word sperma refers to man and grain. And interestingly, in the ancient world, nobody took this for granted either. Nobody took grain for granted. And I think that's why we're so interested in talking about it today, because we did take it for granted and now we're not again. So
we're in a bit of a strange position with bread historically, given our move from all the way back from this no knowledge about grain and bread into a reverence towards bread. Then only in sort of recently, the past 150 years, has bread become this almost worthless commodity. Considering, as you mentioned, like the Greek root of the word sperma, and Bethlehem comes from house of bread. All of these really important reverent statuses were attached to bread. And it's not something we think about so much now, although we're thinking about it now with the rise of sourdough.
Totally. Even, our daily language has been influenced by it. We just look at the word company or companion, and, together, a companion is someone that you would eat your bread together with. Company, you've got the Latin word panis, which is bread, and then cum, which is with. The word bread is derived from the root of the word brew. We've got bread and alcohol, that's the start of civilization, settled society. You look back at the first recordings of bread and 10,000 BC in Palestine, or the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, there's so many different references to bread throughout history. Brothels were associated with bakeries. The Roman goddess of the oven was Fornax. Fornix is the word for brothel. And, fornicate, I'll leave that to your depraved imagination, Robin.
Who doesn't like a bit of fornication in a sandwich? No one's against that here.
You can let your freak flag fly in a sandwich, No judgment over here.
Sorry.
But it is true, because grain liberated man, because as your guy Homer over there, you're a fan, he referred to man as a bread eater. The difference between man and animal was man is a creature whom agriculture, through the cultivation of grain, transformed from a savage beast into a cultured thinking being. And it's with reference to eating bread, because of this transformation from grain into a vehicle of, it's a symbol of life, because you're starting with something, you nurture it, you create it, and then it sustains you. And it's so ingrained in our history. And also, there's a really fantastic scientific researcher called Seamus Blackley. And if you are listening to this podcast to get some tips on how to bake the perfect loaf of sourdough, or you want to know more about fermentation or ancient grain, this is a particle physicist who is doing research on ancient Egyptian grains that were discovered in an old tomb. Side note, he also created the Xbox, and he has a conspiracy theory, that the Xbox logo, which he had no influence over, according to him, this is all hearsay by the way, that the logo of the Xbox is a bowl of sourdough. So, I mean, I'll just leave that with you, but it's pretty incredible.
I want that to be true so much.
I do too. I really believe it.
I'm going to choose to believe it.
But, you know, yeah, take it with a pinch of salt or a grain of wheat, whatever you're...
A grain of wheat. I think it's there is a sort of interesting contradiction, or perhaps not so much of a contradiction, but there's two sides to the story of bread, I suppose. What you're saying about how Homer describes bread and man as a bread eater and how it separates us from the beast. And the fact that there's a lot of indication that hunter-gatherer societies coalesced into civilization in order to more easily make bread through communal effort and communal construction, or to make alcohol, but both are quite related. So bread is attached to the more primal nature of us and also our more civilized side. It almost walks this line between both of them and roots us to the earth and to our primal instinct, whilst also reminding us that we are civilized beings and we are separate from nature.
Completely. I mean, you can trace the metamorphosis of wheat to flour, and you can also trace the marks in our advances in the technology in the industrialization of production of grain, and so too can you trace the metamorphosis of man. So, you know, Seamus Blackley, he refers to the fact that he thinks that bread is in our DNA, that we have a genetic link to bread because we evolved baking bread. And he says there's something really guttural and organic about the act of baking bread through kneading, or the smell of the yeast, and comfort as well. That we can trace our evolution, and we can also trace the evolution of grain and bread, and the two are kind of side by side, which is really interesting too.
And a writer which I very much enjoy, Richard Wrangham, who wrote Catching Fire. Now, this is a book about how humans evolved alongside our control of fire, and how it's inherently and genetically linked to us as much as, you know, our physical genes are. And I think that perhaps bread follows a similar path. Now his main argument is the fact that fire allowed us to get more calories out of the food we were able to hunt or gather, so that allowed us more free time to do other things. So perhaps bread is a symbol or a practical action of the next step of that, because by leavening bread, it's easier to digest. Through ease of digestion, we can get more calories more efficiently. So it's like the next step of that almost technological evolution that's linked to our own biological evolution.
And it's definitely something that even your man Michael Pollan referred to in his books too, and it's not we're not discussing something that is, we're not making a discovery. I think this is something that has always been there, and I think it's something that I would say people, but I think that's very general. But I think if we're to look at where bread is placed now in society, in the current climate, I think it's inescapable that in a crisis that people will start to bake and people will turn to bread. I think people making their own bread and making dough, it's an attempt to feel grounded. And I think we do have that deep connection. And I think we want to do something such as baking bread because it sets us apart, just as you mentioned, using fire, it transforms. And I think transformation is what people are really holding on to at this time. And I think we've always tried to do that. I think that man's innate curiosity to mess around with things and also play with fire has led us to that point.
I suppose, as we're discussing here, we've kind of missed out a large chunk of the story of bread. So we talked about the historical reverence for bread and how it's part of our primal integrity, how it was part of the dawn of civilization, and how it's developed ritual, how it's developed technique. And then we're talking now, more recently, very contemporaneously, about how we're trying to call back to that, how we're trying to connect to ourselves again.
Mm-hmm.
What happened in that chunk? What changed? What made us change our attitude to bread, to view it as not primal, not important to us?
Because bread was always a symbol of working people, agriculturalists, farmers, people that cultivated the grain. It was associated with survival because, I don't really want to get into religion, but we could look at Christianity and, the story of the loaves and the fishes, the basic sustenance for people at that time was bread or whatever leavened product you want to associate with bread from whatever nationality or culture or country that you come from. Whatever your idea of bread isn't bread to everyone, is not the same thing. And I think what happened was the symbol of bread changed because of the advances in technology and the change in people, like our own evolution too. So I think you probably know a little bit more about this than I do, but the kind of post-war industrialization and agricultural revolution and green revolution, I think, has a lot to play a part in the change of what we identify bread to be now from what it was at the beginning of civilization.
I think your link to increasing technology is, obviously it's not a whole story, and bread is a nexus issue, which, is enormous. And we in the scope of this podcast, we couldn't possibly talk about it all. But if I'm to paraphrase Paulin's description of what happened to bread.
I knew he'd come in at some point.
You've already mentioned him, and I do love the guy.
I do love the guy too.
His big, beautiful.
And for anyone listening that isn't, what did you just say? His big, beautiful.
This big, beautiful bald head. I love it. I want to.
Bald head.
I want to stroke it. Want to hug him.
Oh dear. Oh man, the depravity is just creeping out. You're chomping at the bit to get it out. But for anyone that's listening that doesn't know Michael Pollan, if your stack of books is kind of toppling over, and you just think, oh, I can't add another book to my list, just check out his Netflix series. Is it called Cooked?
It's Cooked, yeah.
No, Cooked, yeah. Start with that and then do some digging. But yeah, definitely worth a watch.
The guy's a fantastic journalist in general, but he's got a particular focus on food, and he's got that wonderful ability to take complex ideas and then break them down and communicate them well. So I'm going to completely butcher that eloquent communication and try to discuss
true Robin style.
Try to discuss his sort of breakdown. But basically, he sort of breaks down the technological influence over bread and how during the Industrial Revolution we developed mills, large-scale industrial mills for the processing of grain to flour. What this did on the first step was it managed to collectivize mills into one large place rather than each local area having its own mill and miller. So that was the first removal of the connection between grain production, flour, and locality, because it was centralized into these large mills. And then through developments in these mills, they were much more effectively able to separate the bran from the flour, from the starch in the grain. Now, what this means on a very basic level is when you have your bran, and bran contains a lot of protein in your grain, when there's still a lot of bran in the flour, it lowers the shelf life. Most simple way to view it. If you can separate most of that out and just have a pure starch product, or close as you can get to that, the product becomes a lot more fungible, it lasts a lot longer, it's a lot more standard. And industry loves a standard product. So once this was produced, you had a big difference between bran-containing flour, which was generally cheaper, lower quality, and then you had your white pristine flour, which had a longer shelf life. It was more consistent. And when you have a product like that, it makes the bread production process far easier to industrialize. And that's when the sort of second stage of the removal of locality happened, when you could make bread on a really large scale by inputting a standard commercial product, white flour, mass-producing loaves through a process that was developed, I believe, by Hovis, and I can't remember the name of, but it's essentially fast yeasting, so it allows you to produce...
It begins with C. The Chorleywood method?
That sounds perfect. Thank you, Caoimhe.
Something like that. We'll be doing show notes at some point, and we'll put links and all sorts down to all the reference material that we're referring to somewhere. And I'm almost certain it's the Chorleywood method.
I think that sounds about right, and generally you're more correct than I am. So yes,
I'll take that compliment, Robin, because
they don't happen
far
often,
and few between today. No.
So this process allowed leavening of bread much faster in big steam ovens and massively drove down the price of bread. So at each step, this was removing locality, and then the final step, by driving down price on a commercial product, it made it cheaper to purchase mass-produced bread than it ever was to buy locally produced bread. And this whole process, so from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the end of the Green Revolution, up to now, more or less. That removed the locality of flour production and of bread production into mass market, and it was a commercialization of bread and driving down that price to make the value or perceived value much lower. That's Paulin's description, more or less, in a nutshell. And I do recommend reading Michael Pollan's Cooked. But if your book stack is falling over, as Caoimhe suggested, please do watch Cooked, specifically the episodes surrounding bread, because he'll put it far better than I ever could. But Caoimhe, that's essentially the breakdown and where we're at now. I believe you had some notions about how that affected people's purchasing and class.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we talk about bread during crises, and we talk about bread. How bread was a symbol of the working class, the proletarian, and then, as most things that start off, they like you said, the introduction of white flour, the homogenization of production, so too you've got the introduction of supermarkets, because remember, bread making was about a community at the start. The village miller, the village baker, it was a collective, whereas through that kind of whitewashing, I suppose, of the introduction of white bread, and I'm doing inverted quotation marks, which you can't see because I'm an idiot and I forget that there's no video element to this podcast. But food was our first comfort and our first reward, and hunger was our first frustration, and so the natural order is to fulfill that. But then bread starting off as something to sustain ourselves. The introduction of the white bread, it changed the capital. It changed the association of what that bread stood for. It changed the symbolism too. And I think now in this kind of turbulent and unpredictable time, poverty and lack of access and this viral pandemic, people made do with what was available. It was wartime where industrialization, agricultural revolution was introduced. And through ingenuity and invention, we had white bread. And that was great at the time because it gave more access to people that couldn't afford to grow their own grain or to provide their own food. But then, of course, as it happens with humanity, is other people want it too. And then it becomes pricey. And then only the affluent can afford it. And then peasant bread isn't for peasants anymore. And then packaged bread becomes the new symbol of affliction. And so we've had this really interesting class shift between, from the origins of what bread stood for and what it symbolized to this completely diurnal opposite symbol of bread. Does that make any sense, Robin?
No, I think I'm really glad you started to talk about class transfer and the cycle of class transfer. So for me, when I look through it in the sort of recent history of bread, because obviously class transfer happens of all different types of food on a very short scale. One that's happened in our parents' lifetimes is the industrialization of chicken farming. So chicken went from something that people would only maybe have once a week on a Sunday to something that most people in the UK can eat every day for very cheap. So chicken went from being a symbol of affluence and luxury to being something that was mundane and actually shunned by the upper classes. But that's just a very short scale action. Bread has a bit of a longer story of class transfer. So in the Victorian period, that's when white bread really started to gain its upper class attachment. So anything that was white was perceived as pure and perceived as higher value. So that's when the affluent and the rich would flock towards the finer white flour. So as soon as white bread then became available, and it wasn't a wealthy commodity anymore during that industrial period, and the price went down, and the poor were actually able to, for the first time, have white bread. That's when you started seeing this progression. White bread becoming vanilla, becoming an affliction, becoming something of the poor. And then almost suddenly, white bread lost its virtue. It was no longer healthy. It was no longer virtuous. It was actually perceived as unhealthy. That's when fiber became a big thing. Fiber was suddenly important. Brown bread was suddenly great again, even though historically that's what we always ate. I think what we've reached now is recently over the past 10 years when there's been this sort of San Francisco sourdough revolution, and it's been really associated
sourdough,
with...
if we were to really discuss it, sourdough originated. So, I say everything hearsay because I don't know for certain. I can't say. I'm not a sourdough expert, and no, am I, a geneticist that has traced these ancient grains or whatever, but they say sourdough started in San Francisco.
Well, yes and no. So San Francisco certainly started this modern sourdough scene that's very strongly attached with the bougie, with the affluent, and with hipsters. To the point that when there was a sourdough microbiology department, the bacteria that was found in sourdough was actually called Bacillus San Franciscus. After that, it was discovered in sourdough globally. So it's not it's not the cultural property of San Francisco or of hipsters, that term you hate. It's the property of everyone.
Yeah.
So what I suppose I'm trying to say in this is the fact that when this whole movement associating sourdough to the rich started about 10, 15 years ago, whenever it did, and then sourdough became this symbol of, sourdough with avocado on toast, and this attachment to that. Perhaps now, with everyone baking sourdough at home, regardless of class, it's now becoming the cultural property of the common man now. It's becoming egalitarian. And so that's when we can start to discuss your hatred of the term hipster.
I think what bothers me about the term hipster is, and I'm going to sound a bit like a Marxist here, but what bothers me is whenever you say that sourdough is hipster, or it was, the grain was named after San Francisco because they took ownership over, this ancient practice. But there's this dismissal of this entire class of people that are integral to the creation. So, there's no acceptance of it being a collective effort. There's this narcissistic, yes, we own it, we create it, and it's ours. And now it's being taken from the working class, and it's, the glory of the hipster. And there's no celebration of, and I'd say a lot of hipsters would consider themselves to be quite socialist, but then there's no acceptance or acknowledgement outwardly, maybe intrinsically, sure, but extrinsically, I don't see any kind of recognition for that. And, I think in our current climate, if I was to quote Karl Marx, he talks a lot about the bourgeoisie and the proletarians, and he refers to the crises that are inevitable in our civilization, in our society. But what he talks about is during these epidemics and these breakouts, that society suddenly finds itself put back into a time of momentary barbarism, such as like famine or war or devastation or a viral pandemic. And it's the subsistence of the bourgeoisie. It's reliant on the working class. So that's what bothers me about hipster, is because there's just this lack of recognition and acknowledgement. And I don't believe whenever we're talking about food, especially bread, because again, we talk about community and we talk about collectives and we talk about, this deep connection that people have with bread. It's ingrained in our nature. We do it to feel grounded. We do it to feel linked. We do it to feel self-sufficient, to give a bit of agency. And whenever we start to divide that by class, then we lose that, and then we're moving away from what bread should be about, And I think that's why I find that I have such a difficult relationship with the term hipster, because I don't agree that food should be referred to in that way and taking ownership of certain classes like that.
I think sourdough is, well, it's as we've talked about a lot, it is a symbol. And I think your difficulty with the hipster relationship with food, and I think that is very similar to mine, is the fact that when sourdough purely becomes an aesthetic symbol, an aesthetic choice to designate one's class or one's cultural capital or culinary capital, at the loss of all of this attachment to bread, the people who went into it, the people involved in it, who milled the flour, who put the flour together, who baked it, who served it. Mm-hmm. When it just becomes, oh yeah, this is something I can pop on Instagram and people will perceive me more towards this hipster class that I want to be perceived as, that's sort of disrespectful to all of those stages that lead up to that, the creation of that loaf, which I find difficult. And also I find it problematic because that's something easy to commercialize. That's something it's easy to turn that into a commodity. When people just care about the aesthetic and they don't care about what's attached to it, it's very easy for industry to pump that out.
Totally. And we talk about virtue, and, you have to address virtue signaling. It's a big thing, and I think it's really affecting certainly our generation. I can't speak for others because, I can't speak for a demographic that I don't know. But, food, real food. And when I say real food, again, I'm not going to go into the the history of the terms of real and what is real and what is not. But real food, as in food that you've made. In my definition, real food would be food that you've created from scratch. So, a loaf of bread that you've baked or whatever, and then you share a picture of it online. It's almost pornographic. In our lives, we talk about it is really interesting, and I think I'm going to take we're going to go on a little bit of a tangent here, Robin. But
Caoimhe,
tangents are good.
You going on a tangent, derailing this podcast, so I have to rein you back in. Never. That would never happen.
That's what you're here for, Robin. So, but we talk. If we go back to the beginning, wheat's a symbol also of love and fertility. So, food, the story of bread and the story of civilization are synonymous. But further to that, I think what's really interesting is the story of bread and the story of sex. Like, sex is the making of humanity, bread is the making of civilization. But I think we were living our lives up until maybe this point in this pandemic. We were living a life full of very lusty pleasures. We ate with abandon, we had fast food, we had fast sex. And I think throughout all of this, sex has become routine. Food became routine. But now that we're trying, through baking loaves, as an act, again, of agency, of self-sufficiency, to provide routine. We're doing that, but we're sharing it online because it is a little bit obscene. It's a little bit, nobody's eating in public, but they're cooking. People post photos of themselves, but they're not posting videos of themselves having sex. So there's this little bit of like give and take. And I think, we go to this wonderful article that was written by, I think it was Zoe Williams in The Guardian. She talks about, what the flour shortage is saying about who we are, I guess. But she references Nigella, and whenever you talk about sex and you talk about food, you have to talk about Nigella because she's just a goddess.
You shared her quote with me. Now, I don't know which one of us do you think should read this out to the listeners? Who do you think's going to be more titillating? Who do you think's going to get more listeners?
Do you want me to read it out, Robin? Is that what you're saying?
Look, it's going to do nothing for me.
What are you insinuating?
But perhaps there's a subset of listeners who'd throw us some money on Patreon for this kind of.
I did get, after the last episode, we did get quite a number of comments, but about my voice, and I mean, if every little helps, if that's what the people want, that's what the people can get. But I think the quote that you're referring to is when Nigella's talking about this need to bake to navigate ourselves through this crisis. And I think it perfectly encapsulates what I was trying to say about how, we look at baking bread to maybe fill the void of the many things that we're missing out on in our lives. We love having sex and we love to eat. So I think it's quite a natural pairing. And, she says one of the ways to interrupt anxiety is to let your other senses take over. She says touching things, smelling something, listening. Baking really has so much of that, because when you're kneading dough or you're stirring a bowl, you're really immersed in the world of the senses. And that's really very important, because otherwise you're trapped in your mind. And that isn't right now a very comfortable place. And there's a really fascinating researcher out there, and also his name's John Freeman, and he says we have this compulsion to do everything at once, but also do nothing, and we're struggling to find the middle ground. And through baking, we're giving ourselves structure. We're filling this bizarre acreage of time. And, Brene Brown, she calls it the collective weary. We're mitigating this terrifying reality. And I think doing that through food and sex is kind of the most natural things that we know how to do. Would you agree, Robin?
What I think's interesting about the Nigella quote, because I do, and I think quite a lot of people have they've made this association between bread and sex and baking and sex. So one of my favorite fermentation authors, someone who's inspired me massively, is Sandor Katz. This is a man who's been fermenting stuff time immemorial. He knows he's the Mac Daddy. But he says, when I looked up his section on sourdough bread in his wonderful book, The Art of Fermentation, his quote is eerily similar to Nigella's. He says, "I love baking bread. It requires rhythm and tactile involvement and delivers its rewards slowly, with great build-up. First come the relatively subtle aromas of the dough, the cohesion of the developing loaves, and the visual gratification of the rising. After the bread is baking in the oven, the smell of fresh baking bread asserts itself more strongly, filling the house with palpable anticipation."
Oh, wow.
Come on, Xandor. You're giving me a hot flush.
Yeah, they're hot under the collar. There's definitely a sensual satisfaction in cooking, and I think bread making has it all. I'm going to further your Sandor Katz reference, and I'm going to hit you with Bunny Crumpacker. If any of the listeners out there are not familiar with Bunny Crumpacker, she's just a Wonder Woman. She was a recipe writer, lived in New York, married to a Mr. Crumpacker, is her real name. I think he was a record label owner or something, but she wrote this absolutely stellar book called The Sex Life of Food. Now, I feel like I'm putting myself out there as this depraved human being, where, I seem to have made references to brothels, and I've made references to the links between sex and food. And I just want to preempt this by saying that I'm not some kind of voyeur, and I don't, I'm not. I just think it's very interesting. I'm fascinated by human nature in all aspects. But
that sounds like a lot of backpedaling.
That's a lot of backpedaling. This is a safe space. I'm in my pillow fort studio, and there's no harm that can come to me here. But if I was to go back to Bunny Crumpacker, her entire book is about the sex life of food, and a large proportion of it is actually in reference to bread, which is fascinating. We could talk about the history of wedding cakes, we could talk about love, but what really struck me was this quote from her when she's talking, and it's very similar to Nigella. It's talking about, and to Sandor Katz, it's in the making of bread. And even in Zoe Williams' article, she refers to this, that it's this repetition of making bread and the structure that's associated with it that is so primal, it's so in us. And Seamus Blackley, the ancient grain researcher, he also refers to this. And just before I read her quote, I thought it was quite funny when I was listening to an interview with Seamus Blackley, and he's actually talking about making bread. So again, if you want to hear about how to make bread, go look him up. But he was saying, you mix all the stuff together and then you wait, because a lot of making sourdough is waiting. So you mix it all together and then you wait. And then he says, like an abandoned dog, you wait. And then you knead in the salt, and then you wait, like an unwanted lover. And then you fold it in, and you wait. And then you don't die of boredom, stay sane, go entertain yourself for an hour, come back, knead your dough. So every one that is in food or talks about food, there's always a reference to sex. And it's just... This quote by Bunny Crumpacker, I think, encapsulates that. She says, "From mixing the dough and kneading, pushing and pulling to its earth redolence, the primal aroma of yeast and flour, part of the primitive harvest smells of the soil, to the final loaf, shaped like a phallus, the stiff staff of life."
Wow. That's really something, Caoimhe. I mean, might need to take a little moment. That's some good stuff right there. I mean, she's certainly more on the nose than Xandor and Nigella were. Jeez Louise.
But, even John Muir, you look at in history, John Muir, he says, he said this living in a cave in 1912 in Yosemite. Everybody needs beauty as well as bread. We need places to play in and pray in where nature may heal and give strength to the body and the soul alike. And it's not a stretch to say that you could interpret beauty being the beauty of the human body, beauty of liberation through having sex. Also, beauty is in beauty just visually, geographically, but he also refers it to bread. So it's natural. It's in us.
It's an interesting story, is the story of bread. We've gone from grain to porridge to class to industrial revolution to modern trends in sourdough baking and now to sexuality. Bread really is a miasmic, confusing, enormous, tentacle-driven monster. But it's one that is delightful and wonderful and brings so much happiness and peace in the action of making it, in the act of eating it. It's a wonderful substance.
Certainly. And, you look at the old adage and fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel, and, they left a trail of breadcrumbs in the forest so they could find their way home. And I think humanity is doing the same thing. I think we're using bread to find a sense of who we are again. And I think that's okay.